Hello students, this is Dr. Winkler again. I'm lecturing for the Ancient Civilizations course. And let's look at this should be lecture number 9. So I appreciate you still hanging with me. Hopefully we'll make some good progress today and say something worth hearing. I was talking to you last time about China, so I'm going to continue with that discussion since I didn't complete it. I was talking about Qin, or King Shi Huang, also known as the first emperor. Come back and discuss mercury poisoning in just 1 minute. Remember I was talking about a man with shall we say, enormously self-centered? In other words, this man thinks that all knowledge, all history, virtually the entire culture of China should start with him. Well, but it's quite ridiculous. There's so many things for centuries that have gone on before him. How could he possibly make the claim that everything starts with him if there's knowledge of other things happening earlier on? One way you can do this is destroy all the records. There's probably many hundreds, thousands of records that would go back to an earlier time frame. But he ordered all these destroyed. So when they could be found, they were burned. Now, there's something else, of course. Some of the intellect, some of the knowledge of the past, which is carried on by scholars. And if they're allowed to live, and after King Shi Huang is no longer in control, maybe from memory they can create other records. Maybe they can pass on a knowledge of the culture and the civilization and history to future times. So why not? Let's kill them all. Well, he doesn't quite do that. At one time we read that he had 400 scholars buried alive to kill them. Now, that's a pretty unpleasant way of dying. Obviously, he's making a statement. Now, there's another issue here, of course. Why didn't you put these men in hard labor? So some of these scholars, rather than being killed, were sent to work, I have it right here, on the Great Wall. Now, I'll come back and talk more about the Great Wall and the walls, which we associate with China. But you can see this is a pretty bad man. Yeah, he does bad things, really bad things. So in destroying records and killing scholars, the more people he kills, and he kills a lot of people, there's clearly going to be a lot of people that really don't like him, would perhaps like to see him dead, or might even be involved in an assassination attempt. Let's take him down that way. How do you prevent this? Of course, you have to have a bodyguard, and you have to have yourself away from access to various people. But how about making yourself immortal? How about making yourself so you cannot be killed? Well, how do you do that? A lot of people would like to have a very long life. A lot of people like to be immortal. I think a lot of historians would like to be able to remember first person what it was like hundreds or many hundreds of years ago. Wouldn't that be nice? But it doesn't happen. And people just don't live that long. And remember, life expectancy back then is somewhat less than it is now. Can you get attributes of various things that have longevity? How about the famous metal that doesn't tarnish? It's called gold. Gold never tarnishes. It's a gorgeous metal. I mean, it'll hang around for a long time, and it will not degrade in any real sense. What if you could take the attributes of gold and put it in your system? So you would not tarnish, you would not age, you would not get feeble, and you would not die. Well, how do you get the attributes of gold in your body? Well, you can ingest gold. It probably won't hurt you. It'll probably simply go through your system and come out the other side. where it can be, I know it's terribly gross, where it can be cleansed up and maybe used again. If you have something like that, do the attributes of gold really go into you? How about other metals? How about mercury? If you ingest mercury into your system, it apparently doesn't just come on through and come out mercury. That some of it will actually end up in the system. Now, mercury is a metal, it is durable, it lasts extremely lengthy periods of time, and it is liquid at room temperature. So what do you do with mercury? You ingest it. Now, you and I both know that mercury is a pretty severe poison. For whatever reason, and we're talking much, much, much later, many centuries later, when syphilis was around, the people actually thought mercury, the use of mercury as an ointment, and sometimes even inside your body, would help with syphilis, and maybe you could get a cure. Now, I believe that's highly questionable. On the other hand, mercury is a severe poison. It leads to dementia. It leads to insanity. It leads to people with violent tempers, losing their temper. We read about people like Peter I of Russia, who was taking mercury, popped off one time and beat his son to death. And these kind of things do happen. Now, going back this time frame, King Shi Huang is using mercury. Can we say some of the more brutal aspects of what he was doing? Maybe we can even use this as a means of explaining why he wanted to destroy the records, why he wanted to kill the scholars, why he wanted to work them death on the Great Wall. Can we actually take a look at mercury and say, well, that could have been a factor? Well, something else we need to examine here is that this man has enormous power, and he wants to, well, if he does die, he wants to live again. There's an enormous tomb which he constructed. Now, I talked to you earlier about the pyramids. Remember, they're huge. The Great Pyramid's 481 feet high, 2.5 million stones involved. Is this the largest man-made structure in the ancient world? It has been argued that King Shi Huang built a tomb. Now, this is not a tomb of stone on the outside, but it is, shall we say, an earthen mound, roughly in the shape of a pyramid, that is larger than the pyramids of Egypt. Now, I would say that's fairly easy construction to build with the soil rather than building with stone. But can we say perhaps that this is the largest structure in the ancient world? This might fit a little bit better. A number of years ago, this was quite spectacular. Some Chinese farmers were doing work near the tomb, not in the tomb, but outside the tomb. And they came across this army of terracotta warriors, which has recently been excavated. I haven't been to China. It'd be fascinating to have the opportunity to go. But this has become quite a tourist attraction. As I recall, and I don't see a picture of the structures. These are terracotta warriors. As you can see, let's go back to this gentleman right here. Their hands are in a certain posture. Well, why would that be? Because they were carrying weapons. Warriors without weapons are just buff guys, not quite as threatening as somebody who can do damage to you. Over the centuries, the weapons have deteriorated and essentially rotted away. So they're no longer holding weapons, but they're holding their hands in a position as though they were holding weapons. This was done with such meticulous care. Can you see the difference in face between this gentleman and this gentleman? Rather than simply having everybody with the same expression looking exactly the same, these terracotta warriors had different facial expressions. The people making them, went to all the bother of using, shall we say, different models, different men, as a way of expressing a difference in each soldier. So this is something that wasn't done haphazardly. There are thousands of these, many thousands. Going back to my course in grad school about Chinese history, the professor was saying that the Chinese have never gone in and excavated the tomb. In other words, they've never gone in and looked around in there to see what's there. Now, there are stories about the nature of it, that Qin Shi Huang actually went in and had towns laid out as though they were real towns. In other words, they're models. But of course, there's water involved, streams and whatever, nearby many towns. Well, how are you going to create that in a model inside the tomb? The way they actually did this was to use mercury. So the story goes. Even though the tomb has not been excavated, of course, it's not hermetically sealed. Some air gets in and out. And the Chinese have measured some of the air coming out, and they find that there are significant levels of mercury in the air that comes out of there. So can we say that this is perhaps or probably that there is some truth to the idea that mercury was used in recreating whatever was done there? The man's power is huge. His wealth is enormous. And it would be literally spectacular, I'm sure, to go in there and take a look. I don't know if this is true, but there is a story that one of the reasons why the Chinese don't want to go in there is they do not want to release the spirit of this man because he's so incredibly evil. Now, take that for what it's worth, but it'd be interesting to know what's there. If the terracotta warriors tell us anything, that this man was extremely elaborate in what he did. And I imagine once you get inside the tomb, there are wonders there to behold as well. Well, I talked a little bit about of course, he does die. Very, very fortunately for the Chinese. And he's not around to do any more evil. Let's talk a little bit about the Great Wall. A lot of times we hear about the Great Wall. And we talk about how large it was. Now, let's look at the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China, you're all familiar with these pictures. This is an absolute huge construction. While the pyramids of Egypt were built near habitable zones, and you can transport stone on the river, on the Nile River. This is constructed about as far away from towns as you can get. And it's not, you don't have easy access because it's placed on the highest ridge lines that you can in the northern border, that you can establish in the northern border. And let's get us on a map here. So where does this structure run? See, I got a lot of images here. I want to give you a basic idea. It's in sections, as you can see, along up here. The idea of the Great Wall was to keep invasions from the north, from the Mongols that live in this area, who are pretty ferocious fighters. They fight on horseback, and they come over, and they come down this direction to attack the cities. Now, many years ago, when my first biography I read of Genghis Khan was talking about this, I remember reading he called him Temujin, and he's organizing the bands up there and getting his leadership, and he finally decides that I've got enough power, and he goes west, and he decides to go south. And I'm reading on, Next page, he'll hit the Great Wall and they'll stop him. Didn't stop him. It's kind of like, well, he got to the Great Wall and went over. Isn't it? Wasn't it more effective than that? If you're going to keep somebody from going over this thing, you have to defend it. You have to defend it in any place they can come over. Yeah, it's high, you can see. So I give you perspective here. The door is probably about the height of a human being. But to get over this, well, you get a few trees, you get some rocks, and you pile up and you push your way over. If you don't have that, it can be formidable, but it's pretty easy to grab a bunch of stones. It's pretty easy to grab some trees. You're going to have an army that's going to have to defend this. But once you breach the wall in one place, you're over. They shove another army back here to get you when you're coming over. On the other hand, if this ends up being a real defense, what good is the wall? I do have some questions about its efficacy. I mean, is it really going to stop much of anything? Now, what we see here is actually later construction. I forget, is this about 2,400 miles? Don't quote me on the number, something like that. But it's huge, and it's one of the great tourist attractions in all of China. When the communists came to power, they took over was October 1949. Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists that took over China, wanted to make a break with traditional Chinese civilization. He essentially, sounds a little like King Shi Huang. He wants everything to end at that point. And they have a new order, a new social and intellectual order that is essentially communist. So he has monuments destroyed, and sometimes artwork is destroyed as well, and records are lost. However, the nationalist Chinese on the island of Taiwan, also known as Formosa, was not taken by the communists. It's still held by the nationalists. And that becomes an enclave, a place where they try to maintain or keep Chinese civilization alive. One of the reasons why Mao did not destroy the Great Wall is too far up. Now, since Mao dies, I believe in 1976, it takes a little while before China to, shall we say, break the hold of the communist ideology. And now tourism, of course, is worth billions of dollars. Why wouldn't you cash in on it? And one of the things, since a lot of things do not exist anymore, one of the things that tourists want to see is the Great Wall. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the walls themselves. Let's take a look at this. Can we see this? Is that a lady or gentleman? People, you could probably get a small car here. A subcompact would probably drive along that without too much trouble. Hopefully you wouldn't whack against the walls. So you do get an idea as to its width, made out of stone. And of course, I'd like to give you something else to give you a better idea of its height. Maybe this one I was looking at before gives you a better idea. Would you guess that was 20 feet high? Something like that. Well, the stone structure, like I said, came later than the time frame we were talking about. The kind of walls that were made out of tamped earth. Can I get you an example of that? Okay. Some of these are very old. Some of these are over 2,000 years old. You see, as you say, well, stone versus tamped earth, you get rich, okay? Which is more durable? Of course, the stone is. But this is not to disparage what they were able to do with tamped earth. I'm sure that you had to have somebody who really knew what they were doing. You had to have water there, and you probably had to have a bunch of guys holding on to a tree trunk or something very heavy. You're holding on to it with handles, and you lift this up and pound and pound and pound to make sure that the base or the wall itself is uniform in structure. Some Chinese historians have spent some time looking around to find these things. Some of them go hundreds of miles. Some of them go hit a river. Then they start again on the other side of the river. Some of them are in a poor state of repair, but some of them are still quite visible. Can we say the miles of walls, this is an estimate, would be about 13,000 miles in total? Now, some of this will go back to the Warring States period, so it's not always up on the border with the enemy, with potential border with the Mongols and other peoples that live outside of, shall we say, the agricultural areas of China. While the Chinese are willing to take your dollars as far as tourism is concerned, the wall and the walls themselves are not something that the nation is proud of. Remember, the scholars were sent to the walls to be worked to death. To be sent to work on the walls was virtually a death sentence. Remember, you have to have water and you have to have earth. Earth, you can get that locally. Water, well, if you're in a dry area, you might have to carry it for a ways. There are stories that they brought men up there. And when they got there, they slit their throats so the blood could bleed into the earth and you could use that to tamp it down. I think that's a legend. What do we have? Is 8-9 pints of blood in our bodies? That's not very much. Is that a couple gallons? It's just not very much. Well, isn't it a lot easier to get this guy, put a chug on his back, walk and dump it, and he can make a few trips. When he dies, then, well, that's a different matter. But to take him up there, to kill him for the blood, I believe that's quite awful. I don't think that's accurate at all. Now, there's other stories as well, that this is a tomb. Because when people died, when men died working on the wall, they didn't bother to bury them anywhere else. In reality, they took the corpses and dumped them in the walls. This is probably not true either. If you want something that's durable, you want the kind of building materials that will make it last. And the human body doesn't do that. I mean, your flesh is weak. It doesn't hold very well. Your bones can be crushed. To use human beings as a fill is probably a bad idea. However, this gives you some indication of one of the great legends in Chinese history. Going back to the idea, looking at the wall has a tradition among the Chinese of being the agony of a nation. That you look at the walls as a point of human destruction. So many thousands of men, many thousands of men died working on this structure. The Lady Mengqing legend. There's a story in China about Lady Mengqing. And she had a husband. They hit it off. It's one of these ideal marriages, right? She loved the man. And he was taking me to work on the wall. Of course, he dies up there. She knows he's gone. But it'd be such comfort to her if she could just see the bones, if you just see the body. So she goes up to the wall, or one of these walls, and walks the length of the wall, crying in her agony of losing her loved husband, her tears falling on the ground. And the gods took pity on her, for her great devotion loved her husband. So the wall collapsed right there, right in front of her, and the bones of her dead husband came spilling out. Now, it's hard to believe that legend has, it actually happened like that. On the other hand, when Westerners like you and me I would like to get, there's a section of the wall. See, she's crying at the wall. There's a section of the wall, so I've been told. It might be difficult to find it. That the Chinese visit. I don't think Western tourists go there much at all. Well, okay, we have artistic representations here. But I've been told there's a section of the wall that had collapsed. Of course, there's no way to associate her with that section of the wall. But to a certain extent in symbolism, that the Chinese will visit this. They'll go to this area to commemorate. Rather than honoring the wall, to look upon the wall as the agony of a nation, of a disgrace. Well, sometimes we consider one of the great expansions of Chinese civilization is the Han. Look at the dates, roughly 206 BC to 220 AD. This is kind of an interesting date, or range of dates, I should say, because it's actually quite similar to a range of dates we see associated with Rome. Now, Rome's height is a little bit later than 206 BC, but it's clearly expanding dramatically. By 206 BC, it's defeated Carthage, controlling the center and western Mediterranean. Next few decades, it's going to control the eastern Mediterranean. And of course, by the 1st century BC, it's going to control an awful lot of area of the Mediterranean and Western Europe. So the expansion, let's take a look at Han China. You can see it's not exactly the same as the extent of modern China, but it's very large and it's getting fairly close. These areas up here in the high mountains aren't terribly valuable at this time frame, so the Han don't worry about occupying all of that. And Manchuria is the same kind of issue way up here. It's not necessarily land that you really want to spend a lot of time taking and controlling. Can we say the areas that are most fertile and wealthy areas of China are actually controlled by the Han? We can certainly say that because that's the case. The Han are very, very good in construction, art. They did canals. This is centuries before canals are dug in Europe. Nowadays, if you go to Europe, there's canals all over the place, connecting rivers, connecting waterways usually for commercial purposes. Now, this is for commercial purposes as well. And some of these canals are very, very large, very long, and connect river systems. So their sophistication is quite remarkable. Expansion, production, commerce, even as late as when they're trying to modernize China with Sun Yat-sen, starting in the late 19th century, AD. Many of the people are still considering themselves to be Han. So the idea of the Han being important, going back a very lengthy period of time, one of the great eras of Chinese civilization, yes, that's very important. Now, let's leave China and go on to another area known as India. Ancient civilization, so far we've discussed the Middle East, North Africa, Far East, China. Well, let's go to sometimes called the subcontinent. Let's go to India. The early civilization in the area is called let's go to Indus Valley here. I always do this to myself. How about a map? That's helpful. Where is this at? This is modern-day India, as you know. And over here in the Indus Valley is modern-day Pakistan, largely in this area. Now, the difference between India and Pakistan is largely a religious divide. When they divided India in 1947, the Hindus got this area, and the Muslims got this area. So there were Hindus living here. They had to go over here, over in this direction. And there were also Muslims living here that had to go back and forth. Unfortunately, for modern Pakistani and Indian history, these nations have not really got along. There's been combat and the developing nuclear weapons, that kind of thing. But this area, we read from archaeological excavations that there's a bona fide civilization here, starting roughly 2500 BC and going to about 1500 BC. They have cities, they are sophisticated. Once again, we're using a river system, in this case the Indus River, as a place for developing civilization. Another problem we have is their writing is unbroken. Would be nice if we could read it. You want to make a name for yourself, figure it out. Okay. I don't know, these are letters, I doubt it. Are these syllables? Possibly. Are they a combination of symbols and pictographs? I don't know. Until we can actually get significant text, enough texts, and be able to read this, there's going to be certain levels of understanding we cannot reach. But these are actually the first civilization which we see in the subcontinent. However, there's a group of people called the Aryans, and they invade. The Aryans come from the north. Now, I know you're very good in geography. You're going, north? What's north of India? The Himalayan mountains. Highest mountains in the world. We say that's a formidable barrier. We would certainly say that. But there is something called the Khyber Pass. Which does go through, can you get it on a map here? Which does give you an opportunity of finding a way through the Himalayas. Which one of these is going to give us our best information? I'm not seeing the passes over here. I'm not seeing exactly where it's at. Any event, even though it's relatively narrow. Usually when I think of mass migration or mass invasion, that you have people along a frontier, a large number of people crossing a number of places and coming in. If you have a restricted area, it's much easier to defend. Just get a few guys up there throwing rocks down, it can slow down the progress. We don't really have an idea of exactly how this took place. Maybe nobody cared, at least not cared enough to defend the pass. And I would doubt that the migration, I use the term invasion, okay, it's a military conquest. So invasion perhaps works. But invasion also involves in migration, because it's not just soldiers coming down here and moving into India. It is actually their families as well. So it's a migration. Now, we usually think when we look at, is this going to help with a map of India? Probably not. The peoples that live north of the Himalayas tend to be lighter skinned. When the migrations are going, we talk the Celtic peoples, the Greeks, the Latins, the Germans, the Slavs, we remember they tend to go west out of this area. And one thing all those people have in common is they're relatively light skinned. The reason for this is probably in the areas where they're living up north. where you don't have as much sunlight, that vitamin D, as you know, is very valuable, and vitamin D we call the sunshine vitamin, because exposure to sun gives you the opportunity to get some vitamin D. So over time, a lot of generations, having a lighter skin is probably to your advantage. So we do have a tendency, the people up there with lighter skins. The people down here tend to have darker skins. The original people, people have been in India since the Neolithic. They've been there for a long time. We tend to call these people Dravidians. And these are the people with dark skin. You don't have to have the advantage of light skin. So therefore, when you have people coming from the north who are relatively lighter skinned, and when they come in and they invade and they conquer, you tend to see people with lighter skins on top of the social and political and economic scale. And people with darker skins have a tendency to be in the lower economic scale. When the Aryans come in, they bring the Hindu religion. Let me say something about the Aryans just before I go on. Racist theories in the modern world, 19th, early 20th century, for example, say that there was this ideal gene pool, this ideal race. And it's blonde, and it's blue-eyed, and it's tall. And they tend to say the original brilliant white people were Aryans. Now, that is scientific racism, which is really not scientific. It's based on prejudice, it's based on bias. So even though when you're reading Nazi ideology and theories by some scientists, I would call them bigots in the name of science. But when you see the term Aryan, it is not really the same thing as we're talking about here. That pseudoscience takes the idea of Aryans in different directions. But we do call these people Aryans. And they do come in, they bring the Hindu religion. They bring a religion, can we say that is quite nice as far as making them look good. In the Hindi, the term for the caste system is Varna. And Varna means roughly translated as color. I've not been to India. It's not high on my places to visit because seeing poverty isn't the kind of thing I want to see when I travel. But I have been told by people who have been in India that in reality you can look around and you do have a tendency to see that the people in the higher castes do have lighter skin, and the people in lower castes tend to have less light skin, in other words, darker skin. Having never been to India, I have seen photographs, however, of people in India. And obviously my eyes and my training is not astute enough to see this. I'm not sure I'm seeing that. However, I've heard it. Okay, Varna is the caste system. Start out by the people in the upper castes, lighter skinned people. Later on, it's by occupation and status. So you have if you have a certain kind of occupation, you have a status, you're higher caste. Once again, the higher caste might have less dark skin. I'm not sure. Now, how many castes are there in India? I was shocked at one time to read in a book about the caste system, where they said there might be something like 5,000 castes in India. I'm going, what? There's a lot of people live in India. 5,000 castes? How could you possibly maintain that? The only way it makes sense to me, if you're talking about a huge number, is that you have a basic caste system in this area, this town, this city. And you might have equivalents over here. But in the next region, area, town, city over here, you have a different castes. They might be roughly equivalent, but the caste system here is not the same here. Be that as it may, and I've got to think that there's an exaggeration, or there's something about this that I don't understand. we do have a tendency to break them down into various groups of castes, shall we say, not just one caste. The highest caste are the Brahmins, the priests. Remember, we talked about this earlier in the earlier discussion, where we talked about the importance of religion in your various societies. Remember, you have a religious group, you have a priesthood, if you want to call them that, the people that tend to be on the top of the temples and preach to the gods. And sometimes those people are more important, actually, than are the political leaders. As we look at the relative value of the castes, so we say relative prestige of the castes, in reality, the Brahmins are the highest. Looking down, I don't believe you pronounce the K. If I'm wrong, I guess you can't correct me because we're not talking face to face, but you'll excuse me if I happen to be wrong. I think you don't pronounce that Kshatriya. I think you pronounce that Kshatriya. Anyway, warriors and officials. These tend to be politicians. These tend to be people in the military. These tend to be people that end up in education. So, very high up. Another one is the Vaishya, right here. These are merchants, artisans. The most famous of the that I'm aware of the Vaishya was Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi. Now, he's way in the 20th century, much later than the time frame we're talking about. But his father was a grocer. And as a grocer, you're in the middle area. So this man who's known as the Mahatma, the Great Soul, who was one of the greatest men of the 20th century, a stunning example of character and example of morality and decency, who not only got the British out of India, but he kept the Hindus and the Sikhs and the Muslims from slaughtering themselves when the British had left. Shudra, peasants and serfs. What's the difference between a peasant and a serf? A peasant is somebody in a social economic group who goes out and works in a farm. He's in the agricultural section of society. You go out there and you plant crops and you grow them. But they're technically free. While a serf is not a slave, a serf does owe some obedience to somebody who is usually the landlord. A peasant may or may not own his own land. A serf rarely owns his own land. He actually works it for somebody else. A serf can owe special taxes for the use of the land. A serf can have to pay for certain services, like to go across a bridge or to trade his grain in the market. But the serf is also in the agricultural sector. So peasants and serfs are not the same thing, but both working in the agricultural sector, we have a tendency to put them together in the Shudra. Then there's the outcasts, the famous outcasts, who technically are really not in a caste at all. But a caste of non-castes is a caste, if you will. And sometimes they're called the untouchables. In society, if you happen to be near an outcast, you don't touch them. That will make you ritually unclean. And you have to go through a purification process to take away the stain of actually having touched one of these people. In some areas of India, they're actually called invisibles because they cannot come out in daylight. They can only come out at night. There are times when even if you suspected that an outcast was in your neighborhood, and it could be just something maybe perhaps no more than a footprint in the dirt, but if you suspect someone not that you touched, not even necessarily that you saw, that somebody is in the neighborhood, that will make the entire neighborhood unclean. And once again, you have to go through rituals of purification to get your cleanliness back. Gandhi, whom I've already mentioned, tried to break the system down. I mean, he got to the point where he said he called the outcasts, the untouchables, the children of God. He stayed with them. He cleaned their latrines. He took care of them when they were sick. He said they had to have access to Hindu temples. And he said he would not go to a wedding unless it was between castes. He says we've got to break the caste system. He tried. His moral suasion failed. The caste system is strong. Now, technically speaking, India is the largest democracy in the world. That's largely on paper. A lot of people do vote. That makes a democracy, at least a republic to a certain extent. The school system does not differentiate between castes. In the school system, different people from different castes can come into the schools. I don't know this is a fact, but I would kind of guess that if you're in a classroom, the people of various castes with tendency to sit apart. I believe that would likely be the case. But you can meet people from different castes in the school system. Remember, I talked to a woman who said she had a friend. The woman happened to be an Indian. Apparently it didn't happen to her, but it happened to one of her friends. That in the school system, she met a man who was the love of her life. This is the man she wants to marry. She'd love to have a family with him. But he and she were in different castes. And this is not to be allowed. It was simply an impossibility. So the caste system isn't something that's retreated. It's very strong. And it's functioning even today. Remember, this is a democracy. When outcasts decide to run for political office, if you get enough outcasts voting for you, you might win. Very unfortunately for outcast politicians, there's a tendency for the murder rate to victimize them. Sometimes, I say frequently, when these people run for office, they end up being shot. Somebody from another caste says, no, we're not going to have you leave this. Outcasts have a tendency to work in sewers. If your sewer system's backed up into the street and somebody's got to go down there and clean out the muck, who's it going to be? It's going to be an outcast. Go back to the religion. Veda, these are hymns of praise. A Veda is roughly translated as knowledge. That's very convenient because Vedas actually portray the nature of the religion. Hymns of praise. Hymns are often poetry. As you well know, poetry is easier to remember. If you're singing something, the song lyrics are easier to remember or they're not. I like old rock and roll songs. For whatever reason, I seem to can memorize the lyrics a little bit, at least a few verses or whatever. But setting it to music, the rhyme scheme, the meter, helps you. So having these in the form of hymns or poetry does have a tendency for you to remember these things a lot more easily. The most famous and well-beloved is the Rig Veda. It's the most beloved of all the Vedas. Karma. Now, karma is the tally of good and bad. You can see in this system, as Americans, we're used to social mobility, freedom, get an education, get a better job, live in a different neighborhood, go to a different town, all these kinds of things we take for granted. But can we say, at least among the outcasts and maybe other groups as well, you do look at these and say, my goodness, these people are restricted. This is not a good situation. How do you stand it? Why don't you change it? Why don't you rebel? See, in the belief system of the Hindus, we have the idea of karma. This is the tally of good and bad. As you live your life in a moral, decent manner, and part of living your life is to accept your lot in life. To say, if I was born a Shudra, it is just that I was born a Shudra. I'm because of the karma of a previous life. And if I'm good, if I take care of myself, if I live in a moral manner, then I can move up. Maybe I start out as Shudra, maybe next time I'm a Vaishya or a Kshatriya. On the other hand, I might be a Vaishya Shudra. If I'm kind of a rat and my karma, well, my karma is bad, not good karma, then maybe I can go down. Maybe I can go down considerably. Maybe I can drop from a Shudra to an outcast. That's a pretty big drop. Sometimes animals are placed on the system as well. If I go down farther, maybe I will not be a human anymore, and I will come back as an animal. Of course, some animals are more pleasant than others. This is called samsara, which you and I would translate as reincarnation. This is the cycle of birth and death. This is a cycle by which your life is not the end of things. You don't come into existence when you're born, and wink out of existence when you die. You have lived before for many generations over a lengthy period of time. Cycle of birth and death. If that's true, wouldn't it be very interesting if you could key into your former lives? Well, as a historian, you wouldn't even have to go to the written records. You wouldn't even have to learn a language, which was probably dead a number of years ago. Just talk to yourself. Well, do people, as they lead their lives, have a tendency to see that there is a connection to a previous life? I don't understand dreams. I'm not a psychologist. Dreams are kind of screwy to me. Usually they're nonsense, things that couldn't have happened. But let's take a look at this. There have been times when I've had very, very, very moving dreams. There was one time, and yes, I was into military history. Yeah, I saw the war movies. It's not terribly surprising at one point or another I would dream about being in the military. But I was out one time in a military operation. I'm a soldier. I'm carrying a weapon. I glanced to I see something out of the side of my eye. I glance over there. There's two enemy soldiers. I pull out with my rifle. It's a semi-automatic, and I go bang, bang, and I miss. One bullet goes between them. One bullet goes in the tree right next to him. And then one shoots. I see the flash of the rifle, and the bullet goes through my chest. And I fall down. That's the time when you wake up. And I'm going, man, that was a vivid dream. Wow, goodness. Really? You see, people say, well, there's your former life. You were a soldier. Let's call World War II. I was born a few years after World War II. So my spirit might have been around for a little while until he found another host. And I was killed in a war. Can't I see that as evidence? I'm going. There was another time, this is much earlier time frame historically. I remember having a dream where I was hanged. Was I a rustler? Was I robbing? I don't know why they hanged me, but I was hanged. Now, you see that in Western movies. We see that on Westerns on television. It's not terribly surprising that would be in my brain. It's enormously unpleasant to be hanged, and when they hanged me, I woke up. But see, weren't those other lives? Can't you argue, if you believe in reincarnation, that for at least for a brief, fleeting instant in my dreams, I can connect with a former life? Can you say I'm very skeptical? Now, can I ask you a question? I'd like to do this in person, but you can't do it. Do Christians believe in reincarnation? Do Christians believe that you will be born again? I believe it's in John chapter 3, where a man by the name of Nicodemus came to see Jesus in the night. Can we say he was embarrassed to see him in the daylight? If they associate a Christian with Nicodemus, that's not terribly flattering, because Nicodemus believes at least this much, He says, we know you are a prophet because of the kinds of things you're doing. But he's afraid to come and see Jesus in the light of day. If you're a believing Christian, you probably want to be able to state openly that you believe and not hide out. Nonetheless, when Nicodemus addresses Jesus, Jesus says, behold, a man must be born of the water and the Spirit to enter into the kingdom of God. And Nicodemus asks him a question. He says, what? Am I going to go into my mother's tummy again? To be born once again? And Jesus says, no, you're misunderstanding what I'm saying. We say Jesus, therefore, is making a direct comment that we are not reincarnated. Probably. Once again, I'm not a theologian, but probably you can certainly make that as an interpretation. So I want to give deference to this rather than just dismiss it. When I was in the Navy Reserves 30 odd years ago, there's no Navy in Utah. So we got on the airlift. Sometimes the airlift left from the Salt Lake City airport. Right across from the airport is a Air National Guard building. And that's where we get on the airlift. We fly to California. Other times we go to Hill Field up by Ogden and catch the airlift there to fly down to California. There's water down there. We would drill at the Naval Air Station Alameda and also on Treasure Island. Well, interesting experience. And you're just a bunch of people hanging out. And yeah, you're wearing your uniforms. You get on a C-9, which is actually a commercial transport vessel, but I think the military calls it a C-9. And you get on the thing and you fly down there. And seating arrangements can be, sit with your buddies, people you talk to. One time I'm on here and I happen to be next to a young lady. She's drilling down there the same thing I'm doing. And to kill time, there's no in-flight movies, to kill time and strike up a conversation. She was very interesting. She said she believed in reincarnation. There's some prominent people, movie stars or whatever, that they're buying into this. And I go, well, that's very interesting. I wanted to know her rationale. And she read some of these books by some of these people. And I've not read these books, but she was actually making an argument. The arguments are quite, to her, quite convincing. And I said, well, that's really interesting. I said, she says, I've lived before. And I said, well, can you tell me about your previous life? He says, yes. I was a Spartan soldier. See, I try not to be sexist, but somehow I thought if you were a man and you were reincarnated, you'd come back as a man. The lady I'm talking to is clearly a woman, but she had been a man. Now, Spartans. Could you imagine at the time of ancient Greece, a Spartan soldier, there's only never more than 2,000 of these. The system was so brutal that if you even survived from childhood to adulthood, I mean, sometimes you were beat to death. We do have accounts, eyewitness accounts of boys being beat to death because I guess they didn't do something right. The numbers are never large. And how many people live in ancient Greece? At the same time, down in Sparta, you got a couple, 3,000 soldiers at the most. Up in Athens, the entire community, you might have 40,000 people. If you go by extension of that time frame, there are tens of millions of people living in India. There are tens and tens of millions of people living in China at exactly the same time. So having been a Spartan soldier in that generation is an extremely small percentage. But let's take it at face value. I'm not going to dismiss her. I said, wow, this is absolutely fascinating. And you were a Spartan soldier? Yes. So I didn't have a pen with me at the time, maybe I did, but I didn't take notes. I would have had good information, by darn. So I started asking her questions. I said, well, there are certain things we don't understand about Spartan civilization, including they did speak a different language. I should call it a different language, a different dialect from the other places in Greece, including the Athenians. Could you address the difference in dialect? She says, I don't know anything about that. Okay, so all right, let's get off the language. That's pretty complicated anyway. So I said, well, there's certain things we do not necessarily understand about how the kind of armor and clothing the Spartan soldiers used, and how they were worn. So I asked her a comment on that. She says, I don't know anything about that. She didn't know anything about anything, but she's a Spartan soldier. Now, I'm not trying to say that I want to put her belief system down, but if I were reincarnated, I would like to think that I have a greater knowledge of my pre-existence, pre-existence is a strong word, of my former lives, than I don't know anything. Okay, samsara, reincarnation, cycle of birth and death. So I can get the screen back here. Okay. Now, as a historian, if we could get access to our former lives, that would be absolutely fascinating. However, can we say it's a drag? I mean, death and outline. I'll do it over again. Maybe I'll be better and end up in higher caste next time. Possibly. But to them, having this go on indefinitely is not the ideal. You need to be able to break the cycle of birth and death. You do this with extreme asceticism or yoga. Asceticism is kind of denying yourself for a higher state. Asceticism, sometimes we call these yogis. Where there are, well, as a person. Here's a man who's apparently denying himself. Apparently he's not living out in a hut or building. He is not wearing, well, I'm going to say he's not wearing much clothing at all. Something on his head. You can see he's not extremely well fed. Sometimes these people would, as you can see, they take certain positions. And the idea is that, well, you meditate on the nature of your existence. You think about yourself. I remember reading a little bit about modern yogas, and they say, what do you think about? Well, your pulse. Okay, I'm not really sure all of that. But you're supposed to get a higher level of understanding. And when you see a yoga or a yogi near villages, sometimes these people are received with a great deal of pride in the community. And sometimes they'll sit in the same position for very lengthy periods of time. The people respecting them will often bring food and water and maybe put it in bowls in front of them. And they'll move at least enough to keep themselves alive. But if you do this successfully, you will escape from this cycle. And this is what they call moksha. I talked about the Vedas. I need to also talk about the Bhagavad Gita. This is kind of the handbook, the spiritual guide. Among Christians, we tend to look at the New Testament as our spiritual guide. In other words, the understanding of Jesus' ministry is very strongly expressed in the New Testament, in the Gospels. The other books of the New Testament are books, or should say letters. Well, the book of Acts is a history, but the rest of it is a bunch of letters written by apostles. That is why we have the New Testament. The accounts of Jesus, the history in the Acts, and the epistles. It's not a very big book. I'm sure you've all read it, probably numerous times. You sit down and read it, and it reads fairly easily. It's not challenging wording at all. But if you are a believing Christian, you do familiarize yourself with this. In the Hindu religion, we have the Bhagavad Gita. Essentially is the spiritual guide. This is the guide that people will look. It's a shorter book. I shouldn't admit this. I've tried to read it. I failed because even getting a few pages. There are so many levels of understanding coming from the Hindu religion and also from the culture of India that as I'm reading this, it just doesn't make sense. And I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying that I was not astute enough, intelligent enough, informed enough to appreciate really what I was reading. It has been argued that Gandhi, I've mentioned in a couple of contexts already, that Gandhi actually had read this so much that he had memorized it. So, very important guide. Spiritual guide, tell you how to believe, tell you how to act. We're still talking about India. Let's talk about something that's what ends up being a reform movement from Hinduism. And this is Buddhism. Very important religion coming out of India. One of the fascinating things about Buddhism, and there are many, one of the fascinating things about Buddhism is that it essentially develops in India as a reaction or reform movement among the Hindus. And it takes the religion in a different direction. However, over time, though initially Buddhism was a successful religion in India, over time the Hindu religion kind of brought it back in. One of the fascinating things about the Hindu faith is this. You do have basic core religions, but over time you have various factions is the wrong word. You have various emphasis and various gods and various teachings. And they'll exist for a while and sometimes they get reabsorbed back into the matrix. This is apparently what happened in Buddhism. It was a strong movement, but over time the flexibility of Hinduism kind of reabsorbed it. So Buddhism is actually more well received in other places of Asia than India. Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia have a tendency to be Buddhist, very strongly Buddhist. China, despite the fact what the communists were trying to do, throwing out beliefs, destroying religion, China is by and large Buddhist. And it was just the case in Japan. So, starts out in India, doesn't really end up in India so very well, spreads to other places. The Buddha, essentially Buddha means enlightened one, he who is enlightened. Once we have an enlightened one here, we started with the name Siddhartha Gautama. That is his original name, but it's not commonly used. Usually it's Buddhism, it's Buddha, the Buddha. And the idea was that at one time, it's a good story, he was sitting underneath a tree and trying to contemplate the nature of reality, the nature of the universe, and it hit him that he was enlightened at that point. And then began to spread his ideas. Basic ideas include this. People should scorn desire and seek good. Okay. One of the things I really, really want to emphasize in this discussion is scorning desire. We'll come back and talk about that in a couple of other contexts as we progress. There's no rebirth. Okay. The idea of samsara, reincarnation, birth and rebirth, coming back again is gone. When you're reforming Buddhism, that's one of the things that, for reforming Buddhism, said it wrong, reforming Hinduism. We do have a tendency to see that this is one thing that the Buddha does not want. There is no rebirth. This is our life. That's it. Scorn desire. So after this life, what do you have? If you scorn desire and seek good, you enter a state called nirvana. Even experts on the history and religion of Buddhism do have a tendency to say that this is poorly defined. We've got a Buddha up here, gotta have a Buddha. Let's get a Buddha for you. Okay, well, these are images. There are various kind of Buddhas. There's laughing Buddhas and and Buddhas that you got a chunky Buddha, laughing Buddha. There's the gold Buddha. I mean, apparently these are representations. Very much as Christians look at churches, it helps them remind them of the religion. When the Buddhists do have temples, but when the Buddhists see the Buddha, a representation of the Buddha, that tends to remind them of the religion. Some of these are artistic masterpieces. Some of these are laced with gold. So they're very, very expensive. Well, let's go back to the state of peace. Like I said, is in many respects, it's somewhat ill-defined. What is it really like? Now, as we look at theories, I shouldn't call them theories, they're doctrines, they're theologies of the afterlife. In most religions, the idea of the afterlife is a little bit vague. We're not really sure what goes on. But can we say in Buddhism, the idea of the afterlife, the nirvana state of peace, is even less defined? Apparently, according to the teachings, we're not sure about what form we exist, spirit or whatever. Some people are going to say it's a state of mind. But it's desirable, however you want to define it. It is desirable. The nirvana, the state of peace, is what you're trying to achieve. You do so by the Four Noble Truths. And you come down here to the Eightfold Path. Let me give myself a little time check and see where I'm at. And I've got a couple of minutes left. Let me at least introduce this. I'm going to say right off, and I'm sure I'm going to keep saying this, that some of the basic ideas that we translate from Buddhism end up being repetitive. I've said it, let's say it again in sometime a different format, but sometimes it is exactly the same idea. Well, we're going to do this. We're going to discuss the Four Noble Truths, and then we're going to go to the Eightfold Path, giving deference to the idea that there is going to be a repetitive nature to this. But I don't see any reason to jump in this for a minute or two, and then I'll come back and repeat it again anyway. Why don't I give you time off for good behavior? You're good students, you're staying with this, you're overlooking my mispronunciations. So I will continue with this in our next lecture. In the meantime, have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I'll speak to you later.